Welcome to the second part of the Passport.js user authentication series. In this video, we're going to be starting a couple videos on how to implement the Passport JWT strategy from the Passport framework. Now, if you're just starting here, if you just found this video or you jumped all the way here, in the description I have a link to the playlist that this video kind of resides in, which also has some of the prerequisites that you'll need to understand what's going on here. Now, the video that you must watch, unless you have a firm grasp of how JWTs work, is the video on how JWTs work. I think that might be like right before this in the playlist, but you should be able to find it. That video is going to walk you through what is a JWT, what are the components of it, and how do we sign and verify or issue and verify a JSON web token. If you've watched that, you should be fine in the next couple videos. But I would also recommend the first part of this series, we went through the Passport local strategy. And in doing so, we talked a lot about the inner workings of the Passport framework. And in this second part, since it's a little bit more advanced, I'm going to be skipping over those details. So if you find yourself lost, for example, in the process of generating and validating a username and password in a database, or maybe the verify callback for the Passport middleware, I would suggest going back to the first part of this series and specifically just watching the configuration video for the Passport local strategy. That said, I'm going to do my best to kind of explain things as we go along here and try to make this as independent of a video as possible. Now, before we start to code, I want to go through the options that we have here when implementing a JWT authentication strategy. So we're working with the Passport JWT middleware strategy, but we don't necessarily need to. And this is going to be the most confusing part for someone looking for a solution on the internet, because there are all sorts of ways that you can actually implement a JWT strategy in your application. And because of that, you'll have people who understand JSON web tokens pretty well, and they'll have their own custom strategy working, but they won't explain kind of how they got to that strategy. And it leaves you, the reader of the tutorial, just thinking to yourself, well, what's the actual correct way to do this? And in this video, I've stuck with the Passport JWT middleware, not because it's 100% necessary, but because I think it's kind of grounded and it gives us a framework to start with, and then we can kind of customize on the fringes as we see fit. If we were trying to be very complex about this, and probably the reason you would do this is if you were maybe trying to write your own authentication framework, or you're building your own authentication server, or something that you have to do that's extremely custom. The most complex thing that you could do is you'd use the Node.js crypto library and then pair that with your own express middleware that work together to authenticate your users. Now, I have no interest in doing this because there's a lot of code that you'd have to write to do that. But given the fact that we actually went through the process of issuing and verifying JWTs with the Node.js crypto library, you already have a pretty good head start if you did choose to use this. Now, the somewhat complex method for authenticating users via JWT would be to use something like the JSON web token NPM library, which is going to give you a little bit more abstraction. You have a lot less things to think about when you're actually issuing and verifying the JWTs, but you're still left with writing your own custom middleware for your Express application. So that leads us to the least complex method, which is what we are going to do, and that is to use the JSON web token NPM library. So it's going to be really simple to issue and verify the JWTs, and then we'll use the already built framework, Passport.js, and then plug in the Passport JWT strategy into that framework so we have our middleware written for us. But you don't need this. Like I said, there's a lot of different ways that you can do JWT authentication. The reason we're going to go with the Passport JWT strategy is because it kind of just takes care of some of the tedious things like, say, error handling or extracting the token from the authorization HTTP header. Like all of those things you have to write your own code for, which is also going to be error prone, and you've got to test it. So we would prefer to kind of offload that to a framework that's already been tested and used by a lot of different use cases. So that's kind of why we're starting with the Passport JWT strategy, but wanted to lay that out for you. The last thing that I want to go through before we get into this is the basic conceptual flow of how JWT authentication is going to work. Now, this slide right here assumes that you understand the issuance and verification process of a JWT, which again was in that prerequisite video in this playlist. But anyways, what happens is a user is going to log into a web app. So we'll assume that they're already registered, they're already stored in the database. Our application is going to go through the basic password verification process. I talked about that in the session-based authentication or the Passport local video. But basically all we're doing is we're taking the username that the user is going to log in with. We look up that user in the database, and then in the database we have a salt and a hash stored for that user. Then we're going to use some of the Node.js crypto library methods to actually take the plain text password that the user just passed to us and compare it against the salt and the hash that were stored for that user record in the database. If the user has validated correctly based on our logic, then we are going to use, we'll say, the JSON Web Token NPM library to issue them a new JWT token. Now this JWT token has information about that user as well as a signature from the server itself. So one of those pieces of information is probably going to be the database ID of the user. So then the user client, which is usually a browser, is going to store that JWT. So back up just a second, the server issues the JWT and sends it in the response body of the HTTP request. Then the user client receives that HTTP request and stores the JWT that it received there in local storage or maybe even a cookie. It doesn't exactly matter where you store it, it just has to be persistent storage in the browser. Then on every single HTTP request that requires some sort of authentication, so maybe you're trying to access a protected API, the user is going to, or the user client is going to attach that JWT in, most commonly, but not always, the authorization HTTP header. The important thing is that you put that JWT in the correct header that the server is expecting. And the authorization header is just the most common that you'll probably see. Then the server looks for that JWT in the authorization header because you've coded it to do so, and it's going to use the JSON Web Token library to verify the signature of the JWT. If the signature is verified, we know two things. We know that the JWT has not been tampered with, none of the data in it has been tampered with. We know that it also came from the person that we expected it to come from. So if the signature is valid, the server then will decode the JWT, which is in base64 URL encoding. So all we're doing is just taking that from base64 URL to JSON format. Then we will read the payload, which is going to have information about the user. So we're going to probably go for the payload.sub field. That's the most common place to find this information, and it's where we're going to implement it in this video. And we're going to grab from that field is going to be the database ID for the user. So then the server is going to take that ID, look up the user in the database, and then now it has the full user object. It can do whatever it wants with that user object. In our case, it's going to attach it to the express request object, and then we can use it within our routes. And then finally, once all that has happened, the user is going to have access to the resource that they requested, and our flow is complete. That's the process. If you ever find yourself confused as to what we're doing with the code later in this video and the next couple videos, I suggest that you kind of keep this, pause the video on this slide, take a screenshot of it, maybe even print it out so that you know exactly the pseudocode steps that we are going through. Okay, so the next thing that we'll do is come back to our code, and what I have open is a GitHub repository that you can download yourself. And how I've structured it is we have two branches on this repository. Let me see if I have it open in the browser. We can just visit it there. There we go. So here's the repository that we have. I just finished it up a few minutes ago. But basically we have two branches to work with. So the first branch that we have is going to be master. And this is what you're going to have as the default when you clone this. And it's going to give you a basic starter skeleton for implementing the JWT authentication strategy. As I talked about in other videos, my goal here is not to teach you how to write an Angular app. It's not to teach you how to write an Express app, and it's not to teach you how to use a database with Express. The goal here is to solely focus on the authentication piece. So what I've done in this template is I've done all the implementation for all of those pieces that I don't want to cover, and I've left blank the specific pieces that relate to the authentication. Alright, so when you clone this, and you come back to whatever code editor that you're using, you'll go ahead and npm install in the base of the folder, and then you also, over here, I'm in the Angular folder, so right here, you'll go in the Angular folder and also type npm install. Once you've done that, then you'll go to the .env file, and you're going to enter these three variables. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this, but I guess if you're using this as like kind of a starter, you'll eventually need to implement a production database string, but this is going to be entirely sufficient right here. And then you're also going to have to come over to this script right here, generate key pair. And we talked about this in the prerequisite video on public key cryptography. And this is the exact file that I used in that video, and all it's going to do is create an RSA public and private key pair, and then it's going to save it to the current directory. Now our Passport JWT strategy is going to use this public private key pair to issue and verify the JWTs. So you're going to need to generate this. The one thing that I'll note about running this file, if you run into an error trying to run this, then it's probably because your Node.js version is not great enough. I think there is some method here. I don't know which one exactly. It might have been the generate key pair sync from the crypto library, but it was only implemented in, I think it was version maybe 10 or something. You can go ahead and find that. We're in the master branch right here, but in the final branch you'll see exactly how to start the app, and it gives you the required Node.js version. I think it's like 10. Let's just verify this right now. So let's go skip over to the final branch, which has the final implementation of everything, and it's going to tell you that you need version 10.x or greater to do this script right here. Alright, so make sure that you have that set up, and then you're going to just say node generate key pair and press enter. And what this will do, I might as well just do this right now. So let's delete what I've got right here already, and then say node generate key pair, and you'll see in the left side here, it's going to pop up in a second. You should see the public and private key pair that I just created. Let's refresh it. There we go. So we have the private key and the public key, and you should be good there. And then the last thing that you need to know about the setup, I think, hold on one second. That was actually it. So that's all you need to do to set up. You'll also need to run the MongoDB database in the background. So go ahead and do that before you run the app. And then when we actually run this app, we're going to, it's not going to work here because I haven't implemented everything, but we're going to run node app.js in the root and then ng serve in the Angular application, and then we're just going to visit the Angular application to run the app. But that Angular implementation is the last video in the series. If you're not interested in that, then that's totally fine. It's totally optional, but it's just a common thing to see JWT authentication in a single page application. They're pretty compatible, so that's why I decided to include that last video, that last optional video. Okay, so you should be set up completely with the repository. You've cloned it, you've done your setup steps. Now let's take a very quick look at the code. I'm going to purposely try to fly through this, and I'll assume that you're going to go through on your own and get yourself familiar with what is here already. But I definitely want to go through a few things here. So we'll start with the Express app because that is kind of the required piece. Let's open up app.js, and you'll see that we already have kind of our skeleton app set up. So of course we have Express. We're going to import the cores module, and the reason being is because in the optional final video where we go through how to implement this with Angular, we're going to need to make HTTP request from localhost 4200 to localhost 3000. So from the Angular app to the Express app. So you're going to need this cores piece in here. Path just going to give us access to the path that we want to save things in the file system, Node.js. And then we're requiring in passport the .env configuration. I talked about this in a previous video, but basically gives us access to the environment variables stored in the .env file. And we access those with process.env.variable name. So that's how you will do that. Set up our basic Express app. We're going to import the configuration for the database, which is right here. Just scroll through here. It's basically saying if we're in production environment, connect to the production string. If not, connect to the development string, which is just running on localhost. And once it's connected, we should just get a little message that says it's connected. Pretty simple there. Alright, so then we require in our database models, which is one model, and it is the user. So let's open up that real quick. Same exact user schema that we used in the first part of this with the passport local strategy, and we're just having a username, and then the hash and salt will represent the password in the database. Then we will require in the passport configuration, which is where we're going to configure the passport JWT strategy. Now, it's a little bit weird syntax, but basically in the passport configuration, we are exporting a function that takes the passport object. So we are importing the passport library in app.js, and then we are going to pass this variable right here into the configuration function, which will then receive access to that, and then in the body of the function it will actually do the configuration on that object. So that's kind of how that's working. We'll come back to that quite a bit, so don't worry about it. Then we will initialize passport. This is required for any passport strategy. You always have to initialize it so that it runs every time that you make a route request. These are pretty simple, just body parser middleware, except now Express has their own implementation, so we don't have to do the body parser middleware that you're used to seeing probably. So something like app.use bodyparser.json. We don't have to do that because Express has their own implementation now. Here's the cores we talked about. This line right here is going to allow you to kind of combine the Angular and Express apps. Since the Angular thing is optional, I'm not going to go through it too much, but it's going to basically, if we come over to Angular and type ng build, it's going to build all of the assets, all the static assets for that application into this public folder, and then Express is going to use that public folder as the static directory. So in other words, Express is going to use the Angular build as the front end for the application. All right, so that's what that's doing. We're requiring in our routes, which should just be, okay, so here's a basic route configuration. If you wanted to extend it easily, you could just add more route files and then add, another line here that would say something like users. We'll say, I don't know, something like courses. Maybe you're building some sort of course module, and then you would have something similar to users right here where we have all of the user routes. So that's kind of how you would extend that. And then in the user routes, we just have a protected route, which is going to allow us to test whether we did the JWT authentication correctly. Then we have our standard login and register post routes, which is going to allow us to issue the JWT and kind of validate the JWT. And finally, we have app.listen, which will listen on localhost 3000. So that is the basic Express app that we're working with. And again, I would hope that you would go through this and get yourself a little bit more familiar. But if you've built a lot of Express apps in the past, this probably looks like a pretty familiar structure. Now, in the Angular app, I will go ahead and save that. We're not going to go through what's happening in the Angular app until you actually get to the video on Angular. So it kind of, if you're not wanting to watch that, we're not going to go through it and waste your time. With that, I think I've gone through everything that we need to get started with the Passport JWT user authentication strategy. So I'll cut it off here with this video. If you found this useful, be sure to give a like and a subscribe. And if you're continuing on, if you want to actually see how to implement Passport JWT, then that will be the next video. And then we'll finish it off with, I believe, we might also have like how to use it a little bit, a video on that. And then finally, how do we use the Angular application to implement Passport JWT. So I will see you in the next video.